Hi everyone, this is Kelly from The Truth in Story, and I'm just sitting down to do a couple readings. And so it had me thinking, because the reading that I was getting ready to do has the Weaver's Oracle as sort of my base. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a update on, I've been working a lot with the Weaver's Oracle, which is by Carolyn Hillier. I've been using this quite a bit because it's at a core of one of the readings that I offer, and so I've gotten a lot of use out of it, not just for myself but for clients as well. And so I thought it would be a good time to do a little update, and then there was something that I wanted to share with you. So in terms of an update on how I have been enjoying this deck, I knew when I held this deck for the first time that it was going to be a really powerful deck for me. I also knew once I got the guidebook that it was going to be an even more powerful experience for me. So the thing is that for me personally, while these images are absolutely stunning, and there's just no question about that, I have a full walkthrough of this, which I will put in the link below. And so, I'm not going to go into a great deal of details or anything here. This one is particular. This is one of my favorites. Most of these paintings are over 30 or more than life size, and they took the artist and creator of this deck over 30 years to create. So we're talking about amazing works of art. So what I'm going to say is by no means anything to do to take away from the beauty or the impact of the images. The images are stunning. They are absolutely beautiful. Some of them are riveting. But for myself, and I did have, because I had a version of this deck that was one of at the very beginning of producing these decks, she had some issues with printing, and so there were some decks that were damaged. And so I had the deck given to me, one of the damaged decks given to me. And when I contacted her about the getting the guidebook, she had indicated that she preferred those damaged decks to be disposed of, although she did say I could keep it and use it to journal or set out, so I have it just kind of set out on sacred space while I actually use this deck. But even before, even just holding the deck, when I did not have the guidebook, I had a visceral reaction to many of these images. This one in particular was one of the first ones, and as I waited, I literally then ordered my deck the day that I think I got the other deck. I placed an order for and purchased the deck itself, and sat with this card itself. There were a couple that I just had, just visceral reactions to the images themselves. So I'm not downplaying the images at all. But when I did finally get the actual guidebook, I had even more of a reaction to the stories. And so the way that this guidebook is set up, each of the shamans or udagans or weavers that are in here has their own story, which is about the same size. It's about on one side of the page you have their story, and then you have three aspects of, like we can see a drum here and a whistle here, maybe horns here, right? There are three aspects that to the person's story that gets focused on and what those symbolize. And then there's a section which is really beautiful, which is her cloth. And this is more of the divinatory, how could you sum up the message, would be here in her cloth, her actual cloth that she makes. But for me, the story itself that each one holds is extremely powerful and is where the key is. So when I do a reading with this deck for clients, which I do, I don't know how to get away from the do-dos that people laugh at me about, but I do client readings with this, and I actually read this out loud. And I have a few decks that are like that, where I feel that the words themselves, the story themselves, some part or parcel of the guidebook is just as much part of the oracle as the oracle cards. For me, it's almost to the degree in which the cards, as stunningly beautiful as they are the tool that gets me to the text. So more in terms of bibliomancy. So bibliomancy would be a form of divination such as I Ching, where you're casting the I Ching in order to go to a particular piece in the Book of Changes, right? The casting is just to get you to the text, and the oracle is the text itself. And so while in many oracle decks it is the image, the title, the keywords that is the oracle, and I very rarely go to the guidebook. In this case, I very often love these cards, but what they do for me is to get me to the text of this story. That's how important it is. To me, this feels more like bibliomancy than anything. Again, this is just my, I'm big on stories, I'm big on words. So, everybody's going to have different. Some people may just always use this and never even look at this. Everybody's mileage might vary, right? So that being said, all of this is just kind of leading up to me rambling, of course. I just wanted to give an update. Like I said, I use this in two different ways. So really both ways are quite similar. It's just, is it for myself or is it for somebody else, right? When I pull one of these cards for myself, it is for getting to the story and reading all of that and getting into it. And then I simply sit with that for quite some time. Usually it seems to be about a month. I have had one that I've worked with for like a week and then felt the need to pull a different one, but for the most part, once I've pulled one in a reading for myself, I tend to set it up on Sacred Space and it sits there for about a month before I redo this particular web reading that I do, which is kind of checking in with a little more of a deeper check-in than just, how's my week going to be going or anything like that. It's just more part of my practice. And so, then that will go set up and I will kind of sit with that energy for a while. I know I've done this for a friend of mine, or a web reading for a friend of mine, and he kept the Weaver, and he would periodically over more than a month pull extra cards around it, but kept the same Weaver. So just spending more and more time with that particular Weaver and getting more messages surrounding it, but staying with the same Weaver for quite some time. And that was really a powerful experience as well. So that tends to be how I use it personally. In practice, but again, it's just that one central. I don't pull three. I can't even imagine, to be honest, pulling three Weavers. Just because I feel like they're so powerful and their message is so powerful in their own right. I feel like you need to sit with that for a little while. I know I've already said this, but she's one of my favorite ones too. I love her. And then for clients, the only way that I've used this is in my web reading, in which this does set at the center and the story is read, and then there are certain other cards pulled around it to guides to help to work with this energy, a timeline information working with this energy. But it's not, I don't use this the same way that, I don't use this the same way that I do a traditional oracle deck. So I know a lot of people have asked me about this, and people have said, what do you do with this, that kind of thing. And I will agree, and I will say that this deck doesn't have, for me, I don't use it in a standard way where I'm just going to pull 3 cards to get a certain basic energy for the week or something like that. It's just, to me, feels like one of those things that is a little bit, goes deeper, and then and you're going to sit with the energy longer. But that's, again, everything is by personal, right? Everybody has different mileage on things. So this is the most expensive oracle deck that I've ever purchased, and for me, it was worth every penny of it, and it's definitely a deck I'll be working, and a guidebook that I'll be working with for a very long time. But what this got me thinking about one night last week or so, I was just thinking about these different weavers, these different people, these just crone energies that you can bump into, and that this the creator, Carolyn Hillier, has had this experience with and wrote the stories of, and kind of connecting to those beautiful energies. And it made me realize that the different times in which I've bumped into similar kinds of energies, and very often written stories about them. And one of them, sometimes they just show up in stories. I have them, other energies showing up in other stories, but I do have one that has her own story, much like, we have these stories here. And so I was thinking about it, and I decided to try to paint it. Now, I am not a painter in the sense of making life-size portraits of a stunning artwork. So please do not take this as me at any way thinking that I'm going to try to replicate a weaver's card, because I simply, at this moment, in this stage of my life, artistically, I certainly couldn't do that. But and I just needed to do something creative. I decided to give it a go at painting Annie, which is this Annie here that you're going to see. And I'm going to read you Annie's story, and then you'll see why it was important for me to have the actual house here. Now, I think I've read this story before when I was doing the stories, but I'm going to do it again. Walking to the city every morning and evening on my way to and from work, I've seen many interesting people. I have a job in the low end of the business district. I walk past all the huge and powerful buildings, through crowds of up-and-coming lawyers, attorneys, and Wall Street geniuses. These daily walks give meaning to the phrase of a city being like a stone jungle. The aggressive male walks by in a perfectly tailored suit with steel gray eyes and a quick, decisive step. A hunting female stalks through the streets with flinty green eyes. She's dressed in a miniskirt, suit coat, and spike heels, clicking like claws on rocks. If I don't watch close enough, I'm bound to run into a little man whose steps are as unsure as his suit coat is of fitting him properly. He keeps his head down and looks around with a furtive glance as he clutches file folders and reports to his chest. Yes, there are a lot of fascinating people in this city, but there are none quite like Annie. I work as a secretary in a small law firm, though it sounds more prestigious than it actually is. The building I work in serves as a sort of buffer between the business district and the more run-down inner city. At one time, a dilapidated old 3-story house sat right next to my building. It was all boarded up, and the steps to the front door cocked into a lazy slant. I can imagine that it had once been a very stately Victorian home. There was something about standing in front of this building that just absorbed me. Thinking about all of the births, deaths, and lives that have passed through those old walls was awe-inspiring. At times, I would just stand in front of it and imagine some of the different people who had lived there. There were even times I thought I heard or saw things, echo things. Once, when the shadows were particularly thick, from the corner of my eye I saw what looked like a little girl skipping out of the front door and down the steps. A sound like soft giggling danced on the breeze. I wondered then if houses could hold echoes or imprints of the past. It seemed to me that this old house would have had a lot of stories to tell if it could only have spoken. I can't think of that old house without thinking of Annie, because night and day she sat in its shadows. I guess you might call Annie a bag lady of sorts, though I never saw her anywhere but next to that house. It's hard to really describe her because she seemed to blend into the house's shadow. A long bulky overcoat and what was probably an old knit hat were the only clothes I ever saw her in. They were of an indistinguishable color because they were covered in an uncountable amount of wooden buttons. Annie was always to be found sitting cross-legged on the ground with a makeshift table of sorts in front of her. Across it were bits of wood and some finished buttons of all shapes and sizes. In her hand there was always an old jackknife and a piece of wood from which she continually whittled buttons. While she whittled away at her buttons, she was continually talking in a sing-song voice, a constant stream of conversation. She would rock herself gently to the cadence of her speaking, and her head was always bent down and focused on the current button she was carving. I had asked around about her, talking to the street vendors mostly, and they would all just rub their button invariably pinned somewhere on them and say that she just told stories. I even snapped a couple of photos of the house and Annie with an old black and white camera I had, but she was always in the shadows and the pictures only showed a vague form nestled against the house. One Saturday on my day off, I got up the courage to go see Annie. I don't know why I went, except I couldn't get her out of my mind. So off I trudged when I could have stayed at home and relaxed. I walked right up to her and sat down cross-legged on the ground. I noticed then that the wood she was carving on appeared to be pieces from the house itself. She glanced over at me, and then she promptly resumed her carving, never having broken her stream of words. For the first time, I was close enough to hear her, and I listened very carefully. Once I got into the rhythm of her speech, I became enthralled, and I simply listened intently. All day I sat next to Annie and never said a word. I just sat quietly as she told story after story. Each story started when she began a button and ended when she was done. The buttons she made ran a gamut of intricate to plain, and yet each one seemed as important as the other was. When she was done, she would pull a little bent pin out of her hat and attach it to her overcoat or hat. Time seemed to disappear, and I was surprised when dusk came. I got up reluctantly, and my bones and muscles protested after sitting so long in the same position. I felt awkward, but it seemed unnecessary to even think of breaking into conversation after saying nothing at all. My head was swimming with the stories I had heard, so I just started to leave. Before I could get anywhere, Annie reached up a hand and clasped it in mine. Her hand was dry and warm, and it seemed ageless in its network of creases. Quickly she let go, leaving in my hand a button, and went right back to her whittling, her voice whispering while her body rocked slowly. The following Monday, when I went to work, the old house was half torn down and a group of workers were rapidly tearing down the rest. I never saw Annie again after that day, and when I asked around for the next month or so, neither had anyone else. They've made the lot into a fancy in-and-out deli, all bright lights and neon signs, no shadows lurking there. I still wear the button Annie gave me on a chain around my neck, and I think of her often when I go to photograph old shadowy houses that have since become my passion. I listen carefully to the whispers of these old houses, but I've never yet found another Annie. And so that's just one example of that energy of these, well, in this case, maybe the energy of the house itself and the stories that it has to tell. But it just makes me wonder, sometime I think that, we have these beautiful oracles, right? And yet we often, I think, run into these same kinds of energies, our own self, these different Annies that we find and that we see if we're paying attention to, if we're listening, right? And if we're paying attention, there's so many of those stories out there in the world that we, have these beautiful oracles, but we need to never forget to keep looking in shadows and to keep finding, sitting in, talking to an older woman or an older man and the stories they have to tell. And there are weavers and there are shamans and there are udagans and there are crones and there are grandfathers, right? All those energies that are out there, and those people and spirits and people out there who have oracle, have messages to share, and we don't ever want to look so closely to our cards that we forget to look into life to find those things. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I wish you all an absolutely wonderful day.